Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks for watching. Today I'm going to do a video kind of like piggybacking off the last one that I posted about the interview with my father, where he told us how he met my mother. Um, I'm going to do this video about how I've seen my father since I can remember. My first memories of my father were when we were living in Tijuana in the mid 60s. We were living in a house in what they call a colonia, a colony, a suburb. It was the second to last exit before getting to the beaches of Tijuana. And my first memories were this old, dilapidated house. Um, there was an outhouse. There was no toilet in the house. And I remember my father coming to the house. We were living there by ourselves. My father was working in the United States, and I would see him occasionally. I just remember occasionally. It wasn't every week. It wasn't once a month. It was just every once in a while. He would come home, and I was always excited when I saw him. He was a wonderful, kind man who loved us very much. At the time, there were four sisters. I think that Diana was the last one, and she was born in Tijuana. I don't remember my mother being pregnant with her, so my guess is that she was born before I became aware of what was going on. My sisters were all very young. I think that Sylvia may have been like 13 years old, and my father would come to see us. They were planning our immigration into the United States, and there was a very big, complicated process. Apparently, we did it wrong um, because my mother was a U.S. citizen born in New Mexico. It should have been easier for us, but we made things harder, and so we all ended up with green cards. I had remembered one morning or one day getting into the car and crossing the border, and all of a sudden, my memories of Tijuana were, of course, a bunch of potholes and it was dirty, and I don't remember having running water, or we didn't have a toilet in the house. We had an outhouse, and I remember crossing into the United States, and as soon as we crossed into the U.S. into, I guess it's called San Isidro, it all lit up. The streets were wider, and I remembered my father being in the car, but when I mentioned it to my dad, he said no, he wasn't in the car, that he was waiting for us in an apartment that he had rented for us in in Los Angeles. It was actually near the corner of what was then Brooklyn Avenue, now Cesar Chavez, and Lorena. There's a market there called Five Points, in Spanish, Cinco Puntos. It's still there. That's almost 60 years ago. And it looked like an old dump then, but it's still there. I shouldn't say a dump. It just looked like an old market. And I remember getting there with my to that apartment. I believe it was a one bedroom, and so my mom and dad had the bedroom, and we slept in the living room. Um, I remember we had a shower, and the light switch was fascinating to me because back in Tijuana, maybe we didn't have lights. We certainly didn't have a toilet, and we certainly didn't have a shower. Um, but my dad was there, and I remember that first day. It was in the evening when we arrived, that I went with my dad to get utensils uh, to eat, and my mother made something on the stove, and we bought some plates and some forks and knives and spoons and things like that. And I always tagged along with my dad. Um, my father was, he loved all of us, and he was very equal. He didn't prefer one to the other. But because I was a son, and because I was determined, I got him to take me with him to work when he was working at a car rental place and he was the mechanic for them. And since then, I would just go with him summers, weekends, and I tagged along with him. I had started recording the videos because I wanted to document his life. And I knew of his life and a lot of the things that he told me. And of course, when I interview my dad, he goes on he tells his own story. But I wanted to document this and tell you the story that my father told me. My father was born in September of 1926, and the story is that when he was born, that day, the priest at the church had celebrated his last mass for the indefinite future. There was a period, a war called the Cristero War, which began. There was a president, I believe his name was Carranza, who was anti-clerical. He was an anti-Catholic, and he just said that you couldn't have pre-celebrating mass. In fact, he outlawed a lot of. He took, I think, he took the land that belonged to the church, and he went out there persecuting Catholics and, of course, priests. So when my father was born, they ran to the church as he was born, and they were looking for the priest to baptize my father. That's how devout people were at that time, and certainly my grandmother and grandfather. And the priest had already left. So someone said he's on his way out to the Sierras. He was going to go into hiding. And my father and my grandfather chased him down. They found him on a donkey going up the road. They stopped him, told him that my father had just been born, and they wanted him to baptize him. And of course, if you're Catholic, you know the great importance of being baptized when you're a baby. Um, so the priest agreed to it, and somewhere near the river or by the river, there was by the road there was a river, um, and they baptized my father in that river. And the priest told them to go back home. That this war or whatever was going to happen, I don't think they knew it was going to be a war at this time, but when this was all over, if he survived, he was going to go and register my father at the church. In 32, 6 years later, it did come to an end. I read the history that apparently the United States got involved and just told everyone just to calm down. And there was some sort of an agreement made where the church did was suppressed. Priests couldn't go out in their with their Roman collars, and uh, you couldn't. The marriages were not recognized by the state. So if you got married, you had to go married at a civil ceremony, and then go have your church wedding, which was not recognized by the state. And but my father served. Of course, he 6 years later, he's 6 years old, and they went to the church. It was over, and they saw if he was registered, and he was. He had registered that he had been baptized. And then the next thing I remember about my father was, and he showed me a photograph of himself as a little boy. And in the photograph, there's a dog at his feet, and there were, maybe another four, five, six kids with other adults in the photograph, of course, black and white. My father must be about, 7, 8, 9 years old. And there's a dog at his feet. And my dad said that the reason there was a dog at his feet is because he didn't have shoes. And so they were embarrassed that he wouldn't have shoes. And so they put the dog at his feet. And then as my father's growing, he told me, I asked him about becoming a mechanic. And he mentioned that he had gone um, to a farm with my grandfather. My grandfather was a contractor. He was very talented as a contractor, as a carpenter, as a plumber. He was very mechanically inclined, and he had been asked to come to a farm. I believe it was to fix a sewing machine, a Singer sewing machine. And so he took my father as a little boy, and my father said that someone was working on a tractor, and the motor was started up. And he said when he saw that, he saw the engine start, that was the inspiration he had to become a mechanic on his own. And so years later, he pursued it. My grandfather taught him how to use tools, taught him his trade, carpentry and plumbing, and but he learned to use tools. And then he got a job at one point with a garage. He wasn't paid very well. He was just there to learn, but they kind of like held him as an errand boy. He didn't do any mechanical work. He swept and he cleaned and he put things away. And then one of the mechanics took him under his wing. I think he may have left to go somewhere else and started teaching him basics. And my dad, I've always admired my father. He's always been very talented and very, very, very smart. And he picked it up. And he learned a lot of things from this other man. And in his late teens, um, he started working at a garage. I believe it was a dealership. At some point, he always would return back to the Dodge dealership. And my father was always very loyal to Dodge. But he went to the dealership, and they made him like the chief mechanic. He was in charge of the garage, and he told me a story that at one point, one of the big shots at the garage at the dealership, had a friend of his who he wanted to take that position. And my father was just a teenager, or maybe 18, 19 years old, and so he lost the position. And so my dad went to work somewhere else, maybe another dealership. But that at some point, that man that replaced him proved that he wasn't as good as my father. And the owner's son of, I think, the Dodge dealership came back and asked him to come back. And when he asked him to come back, he promoted him, and he made very good money. He throws some numbers around, but the numbers that people were making at the time, a peso a day or something, 2 pesos a day, maybe 2 pesos a week, um, was nothing. And he was making significantly more than that. And so he was able to pay for things and support his mom and dad. My father had told me that my grandfather, in his later years, as an adult, developed a drinking problem. And he developed the drinking problem because of the company that he kept. So my father always would warn me, be careful what company you keep. You want to make sure that the people around you don't bring you into these bad habits and addictions that would ruin your life. Um, and although when I was in my 20s, I would go out for friends and we'd have a drink or two. I remember that I always at the end I would always um, limit myself. And at one point, after maybe a year or 2 years or so, I just ended up becoming practically a teetotaler. I would have sometimes a cocktail, if that. I certainly don't like beer, but I don't drink. Um, like I said, I'll have a glass of wine maybe with dinner, which I did last Friday when my wife and I celebrated our anniversary. But I don't drink, and I picked that up from my father. My father, we never saw him drunk. We never have to carry him to the car and somebody else drive him home. My father was a wonderful example of a husband and a father. Um, he never cursed, and neither do I, or at least I try not to. For the most part, I don't. Um, and I told people this, that in my lifetime, I've known of three people that I consider holy. My wife's mom, uh, Brother Manuel at Cathedral, and my dad. They're very good, decent people, holy. I at one point in my 20s, I left the church, and I remember telling him that I thought it was just a big waste, and it was just a way to control people. And then through a turn of events, uh, I came back and with a vengeance, and I picked that up from my father, who, as you saw in the other videos, picked it up from his parents with his mom and his dad, who would take him daily to mass and a daily rosary. But then let's go back to when my father was in Mexico. He would then then told me a story about how he met my mom, and you just heard the story in the last video, and of course how inspired he was when he saw her, and how much he loved her. And I've always, maybe that's a genetic thing because some of you that know me and know how inspired I am by my wife and how much I declare my love for my wife. But I know that it was from my dad. I know that I picked it up from him. Anyway, as time went along, and he ended up becoming the head of the dealership. And then, of course, because of how ambitious my dad is and how smart he is, he opened his own business in Mexico. I believe it was called Hermanos Araujo. That's the name of the garage. That just seems to be in my head somewhere. I think I saw a sign somewhere that said that, or my father told me. And his brothers were there with him to run the shop. But my dad was the one that started it, as far as I know, and that's what he told me. And he, when he married my mom, and then they started having children, there was one story that I always found pretty inspiring, and it was not flattering to my dad, at least not at first. But after um, they had my sisters Sylvia and Maria. One day, the story goes, I heard this from my mom, that my father hadn't come home that night right after work, and she thought that he was playing pool with his buddies. And so she goes to it was a bar where they were playing pool. And as someone left, she looked through the door and she saw my dad there sitting there with a pool stick. And she sent my sisters in to grab my dad. And they did. And my dad was furious. And he's walking home, and he's walking ahead of my mom. My sisters are behind him with my mom, and my mom was kind of shaken that, you know, he was angry. And when they got home, my dad apologized to her, and he never went back to the bar. Um, and then, of course, his business prospered, and they tell me that there was talk of people that wanted him to enter political life in Silao. Now I know that the town's called Silao de la Victoria. Back then I just knew it as Silao. In fact, I didn't know about the new name until recently. Maybe that was the name all along, but I didn't know it. My dad did very well, and he bought a house. They call it La Quinta, which is a country house, and it was supposed to be beautiful with a lot of acreage around it. And my dad was 26 years old, very young, but he had that house. He had been married, and I don't remember how old he was when they came, but they were only there for a certain period of time. They came to the United States, I believe, in '64. I have a Bible that my father gave me. It's a family Bible, and the dates in there as to when they left, and it was like August of 24 or March of 1964. That sounds about right. I would have been about 3 years old, my earliest memories, and we came to the United States in 1966, so that seems about right. And um, they left. And why did they leave? My dad says that someone told him that because my mom was a US citizen, that it would be easier for him to come to the US. And my mom had always wanted to come to the US, to Los Angeles. And so I'm sure that they discussed it, and the plan was they were going to leave everything and start from scratch. And so they did. They brought, it would have been four kids, yeah, Sylvia, Maria, Laura, and myself, and they came to Tijuana. We stayed at a relative's house while my father found work in the United States and got us with the paperwork came through so we could come to the U.S. And then cross over. So, like I said, as I told you at the beginning of this video, we did cross over. We came to the United States. We're living in a little house on an apartment on Lorena and back then it was Brooklyn Avenue. And we moved to a couple of different homes along the way. And I remember that back then I just felt so drawn to my father. He was such a good man and he was such a kind man. And we could feel how much he loved us. Not long ago, my father told me that he regretted not being more affectionate towards us. I'm like, oh, Dad, you were you were very affectionate towards us. All of your children love you. All of us have wonderful memories of you. All of us, think very highly of you. Um, he was fantastic. And then, of course, we moved into different apartments and duplexes in East Echo, would be East LA or Boyle Heights. And then at one point, my father bought a house, and this was and we came in '66 towards the tail end of the year. But he had bought a house in '69 or somewhere between Liz being born and John being born. Liz was born in January of '68. John was born in January of '70. So somewhere between there, late '68 or '69, my parents bought a house after only 2 years, and it was a duplex. It was a house that had a upper and a lower, and the neighborhood back then was, I mean, it wasn't a rich neighborhood. It was actually a poor neighborhood, but it was so clean. It was a nice neighborhood, and it was relatively safe, although a lot of things were going on in the civil rights movement and the culture at the time. But my father um, got a job at the place where he was for the longest that I remember. It was a rental place called Thrifty Lad. I don't know where they got the name. I don't know how it made sense. The owner's name was Milton Hill, and my father went to work there as a mechanic. And he proved himself. They just had him there to like do oil changes and change tires, rotation type tires. But my dad would say when something would happen, he would always insist, like, "Hey, let me take a look." And before you know it, there was one story when my dad says there was a car that was missing. There was a burnt valve, and so they were going to send it to a mechanic. My dad says, "Let me fix it." And they're like, "Well, we don't have time." And he says, "Just buy me the parts." And it was like $5 in parts for the valve or to get the valve grinded down. And he bought the parts, the gasket, and by noon he had the car running fine. And so they started giving him more work. My dad at one point was the highest paid employee, I think, after the owner. And at the time it was very good money, and my father was the sole breadwinner. Imagine that. This was in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and that was not uncommon. The man of the house would be the provider, and the wife would stay home with the children and raise them and take care of them, and attend to them, to whatever their needs were. And that went on for a while. For um, many years, though, my father would bring cars to the house to fix. Um, somebody had a car that would with a blown engine or a blown head gasket or problems with the suspension, and he would bring the car into the garage and he had some tools and he would fix the car and he'd make a couple of extra 50, 60, 70, $100. And with that money, he helped take care of his family. I mean, he was making a good income, but there were 7 kids at one point, all of us in at private school. Back then it was very cheap. I mean, I think at Nativity on 57th in Vermont, I think that tuition was $5 a month per kid. And after the third one, they were all free. But my father took very good care of us. Very early on, I never thought about money. We just always were able to do whatever we needed to do. Whenever, and at one point, they had bought a car, and my dad was always, of course, fixing cars, and so there was a rotation of cars. When Sylvie was ready to just learn to drive, he bought her a Corvair. I mean, know that she probably wishes she had the same car now, but it was a flat four and or flat six, and my father kept it running for her, and she was young and 16 years old, and she was driving her car, and because of course my dad was a mechanic, we had cars everywhere. There were Corvairs, and so Maria had two Opel GTs, and then Laura had she bought her a Mustang. I don't remember if that was before or after my Mustang, but then of course I had the Mustang, and then he got a car for Diana. At one point it was a Fiat, but there were different cars that went. We had cars everywhere, and my dad took care of us. And then of course in the late 70s, late 70s was about 77. My dad opened his own shop, and then things really took off. That shop did very well. And one of the things that I noticed about my father was that all of our customers loved him. I mean, they really appreciated him. They would tell me that. They would tell me how much they loved my dad, or I mean, not love, but they really liked him. And they were very good to him, and they were very loyal to him. And so he had a loyal set of customers, and he did very well. And I remember at one point, one night, I think I may have been maybe when I was a senior in high school. One night, my mom and dad go out, and they come back with a brand new car, brand new. It was a Dodge Diplomat. They bought a car, and of course, my father would say it was my mom's car. Um, but now we had this beautiful new car and leather seats, and it was beautiful. And of course, his business did very well, and he took very good care of us. And we never had issue with for money. He paid me something for working there, and then he paid my sister Diana for working there. And our entire lives were my father taking care of us. And like I said, he took very good care of us. And he was a very kind man. Um, he was always very understanding. He did not have a temper, very rarely. I remember there was at one time when I went with one of my friends somewhere instead of going right to work. And then I didn't get to work until about 6 o'clock. And my friend was driving me. And there's the car, my dad waiting for me. And he didn't yell at me, he didn't scold me. He was just happy to see me. And we went home. And on the way home, we talked about the things we talked about. That was the other thing, my experience with my dad when I was growing up, going to work and coming back. The best memories were sitting in the car and listening to my father talk. And he would teach me about politics and religion and history and Spanish, and that was the best education I could have had. Just sitting in the car and having my dad teach me. And a lot of those lessons from those conversations I still remember to this day, and I keep to this day. So then my dad had his shop, and then at one point he had always talked about this. My father had long-term plans, and in those long-term plans were plans to have his own shop, because in Santa Monica, where he had his shop, he was renting the place, and he always said that he needed to own his own land and have his own shop that he owned. And so we bought a place. He bought a place in South LA, and in retrospect, he should have kept that place, maybe rented it out, and continued the shop in Santa Monica. But hindsight, he left the shop in Santa Monica, and we went and he struggled in LA. But right around that time, all of his kids were older. At some point, I moved out, Laura moved out, Diana moved out, and it was less burden on them. And we started working, and I moved out and I paid my own apartment. And I used the lessons that my father had taught me to progress in my career. And God's blessed me. I've had a wonderful career. Um, I remember once my dad said something about which I would now say that this was wrong, but my dad told me about, I think his brother said, about being at a job and not wanting to make yourself just simply useful, but make yourself indispensable. That they don't find you and they've got to look out for you. Where is he? Where's Miguel? Where's Mike? They because they need you. And now when I think back about that, and now from my experience, make yourself as indispensable as you can, but mentor people with you and teach them what you know. And you'll be fine, but they'll rise up, and then you can take vacations. Then you can you know have a little bit of a break yourself, because you're not the person that's everything pivots on. But then my dad, of course, bought the shop, and he struggled with the shop in South LA until he rented it out. And you know there was one point where I had an opportunity to move to another state, to another city, and then another state. But I didn't want to, because I thought my parents are older now, and what if something happens to them, and I'm not here. I believe that must have been in the mid '80s, um, towards the late '80s, mid '80s and late '80s is when I moved out, and I didn't want to move away. But at the time, my dad was only in his early '60s, my age, only in his early '60s, and he's 98 now. He's been around. I probably should have taken those opportunities and gone and tried something different. But of course, family's always been very important, so we always like sticking around and having our big family get-togethers, Thanksgiving and Christmases, and so and now, my father, even after he rented out the shop that he has, and he set it so that it pays off the note, which he finally paid off the note, and now he owns it free and clear. But he once got a job at a school teaching auto mechanics in Spanish. How That's so creative, and that's so, you know, my father would just say it was another blessing. Um, what are the chances of that? And he made very good money, and he was very, um, important person at the school, and he kept doing that for quite a while. He kept doing it until he just got tired and he wanted to spend more time with my mom. And they ended up doing a lot of things together, and they enjoyed their lives together. As I said in the beginning of this video, my father loves my mom very much, and so um, he loves her very much, and so he will do anything for her. He's quite the romantic, and he's now by her side. My mother's having some health issues. She has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it makes my father very sad to see her. But he's still with her, and that's just a testament to the kind of man that my father is. And as you can probably tell, why am I recording these videos and telling about my dad? And the truth is, my dad's 98 years old, and I don't know how much longer he'll be around. And I'm making these videos um, to document what's still around while we still remember and while he's still here, and to pass on the stories that he has of him, from birth to 98 years old. And I will be making another video. If you see another video on here, there's another video I'm going to be making similar to this in Spanish for maybe my mom if he wants to hear it, or our cousins in Mexico who may prefer one in Spanish. But thank you for watching, and subscribe and like and comment if you can. I'd appreciate the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.